Welcome to Tech Talk with Rishi. Can you introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Scott Sauber. I am a lead software developer at a company called Iowa Bankers, where we do mortgages and insurance and fun business stuff like that. I've been following .NET Core since the very early days. I've been really involved following that and have a blog mostly dedicated to ASP.NET Core, and I've done talks on ASP.NET Core, and so I'm really interested in ASP.NET Core overall as a platform.
Great. You do a lot of talks, right?
Yeah, I've done a few, mostly on ASP.NET Core. Also done a few on Blazor as well, but mostly focused on .NET.
Cool. Now, as you know, with ASP.NET Core, there have been some changes. Before we were using ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET MVC 5, and then
Yep.
there was the introduction of ASP.NET Core. So, do you know some differences between ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Core?
Yep. I guess the first big one is it's just a ground up rewrite from regular ASP.NET. So there's no more dependency on system.web. And as a result, there's improved performance. Like on some independent benchmarks, they're up in the top 10 on a lot of the benchmarks I run on the Tech and Power benchmarks. It runs cross-platform, so it runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's been open source pretty much from the get-go, so it's out there on GitHub. But as far as like the programming model, um, MVC and Web API controllers have been unified, so you don't inherit from API controller anymore. You just inherit from controller. Let's see what else. Another big one is HTTP handlers and HTTP modules are gone. So now everything's just middleware, including MVC. So just middleware is essentially just a fancy term for a method call. So you just have a bunch of methods that you kind of chain one after another. And order really matters with middleware as well. So if you get things out of order, you could mess some things up. Like if your piece of middleware that redirects to HTTPS is not first, and say you have like something that serves piece of middleware that serves static files is first, then somebody could get to your static files over HTTP, not HTTPS. So that's big one is just middleware is kind of a first-class concept in ASP.NET Core. And we kind of had it in MVC5 a little bit, but now it's kind of like that first-class concept, and you can really shoot yourself in the foot with middleware if you get things out of order. So you kind of have to make sure things are correct on that standpoint. Let's see what else. Tag helpers are a thing in ASP.NET Core. So previously in MVC5, we had HTML helpers, which were fine until you had to do things like style it. So like adding a CSS class or something of that nature. HTML helpers just kind of got in the way a little bit, because when you wanted to add a CSS class, you kind of had to do that new up an anonymous object thing and like escape the class keyword. So you had to do like at class, because class was a C# keyword. And it's just a little not very fun to write as a developer. So with tag helpers, you can just write normal tags, like a normal A tag for a link, and use your normal HTML attributes like your class and get full IntelliSense while you type your CSS class. And then you kind of sprinkle in ASP.NET Core specific attributes like ASP-controller for a link that tells you what controller you want to point to. So that kind of leads to a better developer experience, because you're writing HTML and the code you write looks more like HTML, which is the final product anyways. So it kind of removes that level of abstraction that HTML helpers had. So I'd say those are it's kind of a lot there, but there's been a lot of changes, and those are kind of some of the bigger ones. between MVC5 and ASP.NET Core.
That's great. I recall when I was using HTML helpers, especially for navigation bars, where I had to make my certain links active based on the page which I was, and that was really
Yep.
tricky. But now with the new features that you just mentioned, the tag helper, this is becoming much more easier.
Yep, for sure, definitely.
Now, another new feature is Razor Pages. Do you know about Razor Pages?
Yep. Yeah. So we actually built a health insurance app based around Razor Pages, and it's like about 120 pages. So we have used Razor Pages extensively. So what Razor Pages is a it's really close to MVC, but it's kind of like a slightly different way of organizing your code compared to MVC. So it's more page focused, whereas MVC is more controller focused. So in the page focused approach, you still have your view, so your CSHTML file, but then you have this kind of code behind file. People out there are familiar with the web forms. So you have a .cshtml.cs, and what that's called is a page model. So these files live kind of right next to each other, which is actually a big win when you're doing Razor Pages. Because with MVC out of the box, you kind of have like when you're adding a new feature, you kind of have to go to the controllers folder, then you pop over to the views folder, then you go to like a models folder or another project that might have your models or whatever it is. And you're kind of bouncing around between all these different files or folders and files. Whereas with Razor Pages, the view and the page model, which is the page model is kind of like a controller and a view model put together. Uh, those are right next to each other in the same folder, so it's really quick to access. You can flip between the two super quick, and you're not kind of hunting down these different files in all these different folders. So I would say Razor Pages are definitely optimized for like server rendered HTML. So it's not really optimized as much for APIs. So the kind of guidance from Microsoft is if you're doing a lot of pages that are kind of get and posts, it's really good for that. But if you're building more of an API backend for maybe like a SPA front end, like React or Angular, then you should probably just use controllers. But in our case, we're building more of a server rendered app just for simplicity, and the app didn't really require a fancy SPA or anything. So that's kind of why we went the route of Razor Pages, just because it was a lot. It removed a lot of the boilerplate and a lot of the files. The folder structure, like I mentioned, was closer together. Plus, it's just more secure by default. So out of the box, it gives you anti-forgery token validation. Like it led to a lot more maintainable code. So we didn't have those controllers that we've all seen that have like 5, 10, even more actions in them that can kind of quickly spiral out of control really quickly because a Razor page model is just focused on a single get and a post for the most part on a single page. So you kind of only have a get and a post in most of your page model methods. So that also leads to like unit testing is easier because when you're injecting in your dependencies, you're just injecting what that get and post need. Whereas with a controller, maybe a dependency is only used by one of the 10 actions that you have. But with Razor Pages, it's more focused, so you don't have large constructors and all that kind of thing. So, but like 95% of the code, I would say, is shared between MVC and Razor Pages. Like you still have model states, you still have routing, you still have model binding, all that kind of stuff. There's just that 5% that's a little different. So converting between the two, if you're familiar with MVC, you'll probably pick up Razor Pages pretty quickly.
Great. Now, what, to me, using Razor Pages also decrease your developer depth because it is in the same technologies that you are using instead of using something like React, which is a completely different technology from .NET. You are using a lot of the same .NET technologies with Razor Pages. Another new feature,
Yep.
right? Another new feature with ASP.NET Core, in fact in .NET Core completely, is dependency injection. Do you know what dependency injection is and how it is being used in ASP.NET Core?
Yep. So dependency injection, kind of like the name implies, allows you to inject dependencies into your like MVC controllers or Razor pages. So it's kind of like um, it allows you to swap out implementations really easily. So you can say, hey, I want to send emails, and maybe your app today sends emails just through an on-premises email server, but maybe tomorrow you're going to use something like SendGrid or one of these other cloud providers, email providers. By using dependency injection, you can just say, hey, I've got this interface. It's like an email service, and it has a method on it called send email. And you can swap out the implementation really easily, just saying, hey, I'm switching from my on-prem email service to my SendGrid email service. And all of your app downstream, all it cares about is, hey, I've got some interface that I need called iEmail service. I don't really care what kind of iEmail service it is, as long as it follows this interface. So with ASP.NET Core, they baked dependency injection into the framework from the get-go. So ASP.NET Core itself depends on dependency injection, whereas kind of like in MVC5 and just regular ASP.NET, it's kind of always felt like it was kind of an afterthought and kind of hacked in, I guess. Whereas in ASP.NET Core, it comes right out of the box. So they've got a built-in dependency injection container that you get out of the box, which is pretty basic, but you can also plug in the usual suspects like simple injector or structure map or autofac or whatever it is. So this helps kind of leads people down the path towards more maintainable code. Like I mentioned, swapping out implementations easily, allowing for easier unit testability, that kind of thing. So I think it was really good that they put this front and center to kind of, for people who weren't doing dependency injection before, kind of forcing their hand almost to learning dependency injection and realizing its benefits and that kind of thing.
That's good. Now, there's there's also a new file called Proj file. I think it was something that was introduced previously, and now it is very much emphasized. Do you know about it, the Proj file?
Yep. Early on in the early days of ASP.NET Core, when it was called ASP.NET 5, they had a project.json file, but they realized that didn't interact well with the existing .NET community, so they switched back to the CS file that we kind of had in the other .NET versions. So this new CS file, but they basically took the existing CS system and kind of enhanced it with a bunch of new features. So the new features are kind of under this SDK style umbrella, is what they call it, the SDK style CS Proj. And so it still uses MS Build under the hood, but there's a handful of new features, such as you can manage your NuGet packages in your CS Proj now. So you don't need that packages.config file. You can just manage it via a package reference XML element. And it also means you don't need those hint paths. So before you kind of had these hint paths that kind of went to the relative path of where your NuGet package lived and those DLLs lived. But now it's just kind of implicit and makes things a lot easier to manage. And they also slimmed down the CS Proj. So the default Hello World MVC5 CS Proj was like 300 plus lines of code. And at least I didn't really understand a lot of what it was doing. I just kind of let it be for the most part. But now in ASP.NET Core, the default CS Proj is less than 10 lines for the Hello World So it's just a lot easier to follow what everything's doing, how it interacts together, and just makes it more maintainable that way. And probably my favorite feature though is now if it's in the folder, it's in your project by default because previously in MVC5 and other other .NET versions using the old CS Proj system, you had those like include lines. So anytime you wanted to include a file, you had like another line in your CS Proj to specifically include that file. But now, if it's in the folder, it's in the project by default. You can still exclude things if you want, but I think that's a really sensible default. And at my job, it led to a lot of merge conflicts, and now we don't really have those because it's just the default. Um, I'd say that probably the other big thing is that you can live edit the CS Proj now without needing to unload and reload. You can just right click edit CS Proj and just start making your changes. Whereas before you had to, in Visual Studio, you had to right click, unload the project, right click, edit the CS Proj, and then start hacking away at your CS Proj. So there's just a lot of benefits to the new CS Proj system in ASPNET.
I agree with you. I personally like the new changes being made because you can more easily see what your what your packages are, what packages are you using. And for example, if you want to copy a list of packages that you already have to another application, you can now just click copy and paste to the other application, and that's done very quickly. Now,
Yep.
another big change was made with startup.cs. This file. Do you know about startup.cs?
Yep. So it's we kind of had it in like the in ASP.NET, but it's kind of again in regular ASP.NET, but it's kind of again an afterthought. Whereas in ASP.NET Core, it's definitely a first-class citizen. So there are typically two methods in your startup.cs. You have configure services, which is kind of where all of your dependency injection rules go. So my example I gave earlier about the email service. So you can define, hey, when something downstream in my application asks for an email service, give it my on-prem email service, and that's kind of where you define those rules as in your startup.cs and in the configure services method. And then also you define what lifetime those objects have. So you can say it's scoped, meaning it's give me a new one or give me one per request. So you typically do this with like a Entity Framework database context is you just get one database context per request. That way everything's kind of using the same DB context. There's also transient, which means give me a new one every time I request it. So if you have multiple piece of your app listening to the same requests, they're going to get a different instance of whatever you inject in. And then there's also singleton, which means only give me one instance of this thing for the lifetime of my application being up. So where you define all these rules is again in the configure services method of startup.cs. And then there's another method in startup.cs, which is your configure method. And that's where you define that middleware pipeline that we talked about earlier. So again, that's where that order really matters because if you flip a piece of middleware and have it run sooner than another piece, you just got to make sure what the impact of that is. So kind of mentioned earlier with the HTTPS redirection, if you don't have that first, potentially a request could get in that's coming over straight HTTP, which may or may not be what you want. So that's kind of the role of the startup.cs is to kind of bootstrap your application with the dependency injection it needs, and then also the middleware.
Great. Now, this is a good feature. Another thing that has been changed was the www root folder. This is something that I find in other frameworks. For example, Angular also has a similar structure, in terms of folders for organizing certain things such as view files. Now, do you know what the www root folder is in ASP.NET Core?
Yep. So the www folder is a place where, by default, ASP.NET Core can only serve static files out of that folder. So things like images, CSS, JavaScript, that kind of thing. So by default, if you put it somewhere else, it won't be able to be served to a user. So you can obviously override this, like most of the things in ASP.NET Core. You can configure your own set of rules, but this is kind of what happens by default. And a lot of times I like to treat the www root folder as kind of like a bin folder. So I usually have my source files live kind of outside this folder, and then let my bundler compiler kind of take the source files and transform them, either taking TypeScript to compile it down to JavaScript, or CSS and JavaScript and minify those, and then kind of places them in the www root folder. That's just what I treat it as, but yeah, so that's pretty much the responsibility of the.
Great. Now, we covered all 5 questions. An additional question I had was, where can you learn more about ASP.NET Core? And what would you suggest to beginners of this framework?
Yeah, so the documentation, official documentation from Microsoft is actually really, really good. They've got some people dedicated full time to that. So if you want to learn more, I'd highly recommend going to docs, docs .asp.net, and they've got everything from like getting started with Hello World to, let's say you want to know a very specific feature and like kind of the capabilities of it. They've got all that documented out there as well. And then yeah, they've just got like little mini tutorials all throughout that site. So I'd really recommend, if you're interested in learning, head over to docs.asp.net. The other cool thing is that documentation is all open source. So if you find a mistake or you think something could be explained more clearly, all that's available out on GitHub. So you can just send a pull request and submit some documentation. And in fact, I've done that, and it's really easy to do. And they're really, really great about working with you and making sure everything's worded consistently how it is through the rest of their sites, and all that kind of thing. So the other place where you could go is .net, so dot.net, and that's kind of like gets you like all the downloads and everything that you might need, and also kind of walks you through some tutorials and has links to architecture best practices and all that kind of stuff.
Great. I also use Pluralsight. This is a platform for various .NET technologies. There's various tutorials there. I followed a course there for .NET Core with Angular 2. This is a nice course which covers how to create a .NET application with Angular from start to end with .NET Core. So that my recommendation would be in the description also. Is there any link you would want me to share in the description of this video?
Yeah. If somebody wants to ask me a question or something, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is just my first and last name, so Scott Sauber. I also blog at scottsauber.com. So if anybody has any questions or anything, or wants to learn more, I'm
Great.
happy to help
I
that way.
was happy to have you on the podcast, Scott, and you provided some great insights on ASP.NET Core and its various components. Now, you're welcome to be on the podcast again in the future. You can just message me.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the invite, and
Great. See you.
great chatting with you.